Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and today my guest is Jean-Do Massoero, an Alexander Technique teacher in Montpellier, France. And this is going to be the fifth in a series of conversations we're having about the influence of Francois Delsarte on F. Matthias Alexander. So, Jean-Do, welcome to the show again.
Yes, thank you.
In our previous conversation, we were talking a bit about Delsarte's own story of how he came up with at least the first part of his method, which has a remarkable parallel to Alexander's story. Loss of voice, career about to end, etc., and then working out a solution that seems strikingly similar to Alexander's solution. That is, using directions, coming up with a direction or directions that would prevent him from doing his strong habitual pattern. Would that be fair to say? You might want to elaborate on that a little bit. I don't want to oversimplify it, but it certainly seems like that's the basic idea.
Yeah, but I will elaborate on it because there is something that is maybe somehow different or is worded differently by the two men, and I think that Delsarte might have an advantage in clarity. So it's the fact that, of course, he changed the movement of his larynx.
Right.
He changed the movement of the larynx because he found that it was necessary to guide the movements of the parts of the torso consciously. So the word that I am trying to bring to the fore here is movement.
And movement of the whole body.
Movements of parts of the whole anatomical structure.
Right.
So in Delsarte, it is very clear that we are talking about movements of bone structures. He called them levers for one reason, you know. He was not, in fact, working with the muscular system in a direct way. He invented an indirect way. And it's very clear from reading Alexander, despite Alexander's weakness with definition, which can be overcome, the fact that Alexander picked that up, but had great difficulty in transmitting it. Well, it's only thanks to my archaeology of Delsarte that I could understand loads of passages of the first two books of Alexander, because it's not very, very clear.
So it was a key element there for Delsarte that while his obvious problem, especially in singing high notes, was a quote problem unquote with his larynx and its configuration in his throat, but that the solution was a whole body solution or a whole torso solution.
It was a whole torso solution.
Whole torso solution. So, I mean, that kind of a statement would be fairly obvious, I think, to most Alexander teachers today. But I'm guessing back in the early 30s, 40s, in there, that would have been a pretty new idea.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Completely.
I mean, I would think that would be quite revolutionary. So where we left off is he figured out a way to deal with his preconceived ideas about what he had to do to sing high notes. And he came up with at least internal directions to do that with his torso.
So the directions were a complex structure with Delsarte. I think even more complex than the one that Alexander figured. In fact, to guide the movements of the parts of the torso, the first problem is to identify the parts of the torso. And the problem with identifying the parts is that in most untrained person, most of the time the parts are coordinated what we say en bloc. which
Right.
means as a stiff working, where most people have two coordination, one that is when they are resting, collapsing, and the other one when they are stiff and trying to be erect. Well, nowadays it's very unusual to have a stiff and erect person, but that's still easy to see that the parts have no movements. And I've been I've been working on these movements of the parts of the torso, and it's quite simple. You will see people having so much stiffness in some parts that they can't even imagine that it's possible to move the torso in different ways than the one they are doing.
Right.
And I'm not talking only about people that have no idea of the Alexander technique. It's also true nowadays. I think that the mechanism of the torso has been lost during the last 50 years. There are not many people nowadays that can consciously direct the different parts of the torso or consciously direct the movement between these parts. Because before coordinating the different movements, of course, you have to elicit the movements. You have to make the movements happen.
Right.
Yeah. I worked the other day with a friend of mine. He's been a teacher for, 25 years. And he said to me, well, it's quite amazing because I've just discovered a part that I never moved before.
Right, right.
So in the Delsarte system, there was not this idea of simply achieving the correct functioning of the whole system. It was, first of all, a means of expression. They wanted to appear on stage and have lifelike movement, what they call gesture, integral movement, that were lifelike. In order for them to be lifelike, the problem was to have as many parts that were moving in opposite direction during the movements. So for Delsarte, it was not only trying to find the right organization, it was to have a fluid organization in all directions possible.
Right.
So it was more complex than the Alexander technique, I think.
So, but he wanted people to have that fluid organization in order to be able to express emotions and feelings on stage, right? That was
yes, exactly.
And he, I think you said in an earlier interview, he was not thinking in terms of, well, hey, that could probably help the person in the rest of his life too, right?
Yes, he knew that.
He knew it would, but that wasn't his main goal.
No.
Would you say?
No, he was an artist.
He was
was the art,
so, right?
But
right.
he knew, in fact, he knew how, because he was the doctor of voices.
Right.
So every time a singer lost his voice, he was directed to Delsarte.
Right.
So he knew that people would learn how to use their organism better, but it was not his aim.
It was just a byproduct of what he really was after.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he found that movements of the parts were good functioning,
Right.
and he adds up that in fact during his work process to in fact change his manner of using his torso in order to speak or to sing without pain, he discovered that it was quite painful sometimes, but it didn't matter. Because he discovered different types of pain. There are pain that are, of course, a signal that something is very wrong, or it could be a signal that you're coming from some situation that was very wrong, and you're changing it towards something better. So you get pain on both sides of the door.
Right. Sure.
So it's not possible to judge by what you feel, by the pain you feel, to know if you're going in the right direction or not. The only way he found is that you must see in the mirror that there are movements that are happening and that the results of the movement is a lengthening. He called that the law of extension. It's so
lengthening would lengthening be sort of a proxy for general expansion?
Yes.
Because,
Exactly.
I mean, we are axial creatures, so if we're going to expand, it's a lot more like we're going to expand mostly in an up-down, upwards direction, let's say. But there's also the widening aspect, right? Filling out of the space
Yes.
we can take out. So he used, in a sense, expansion, let's say, as
Yeah.
his guide to, is this a better way to do things
Yeah.
than before, which it might seem a little uncomfortable or even a little painful, but if it's expansion, it's probably a good thing. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah. Exactly. Absolutely. Yeah.
Wow. Very, yeah, I mean,
So you
it's,
understand
yeah,
that there is
yeah.
inhibition in this.
Yeah,
You have,
say something about inhibition. Yeah, say something about inhibition because did he actually use that word?
no, no, he did not.
Mm-hmm.
No, he did not use the word inhibition. That was created by Alexander later on.
Right.
But inhibition was really part of the teaching in a sense that you were like forbidden not to use mirrors. Because when you use a mirror, you have a distance between what you feel and
Mm-hmm.
what you do. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yep.
you see, it was a Delsarte idea to give lessons to your own reflection. So you
Right.
have to move the parts of your torso, and you have to see them moving. So
Right.
that idea of inhibition is so ingrained in the way of teaching that it is clear that he would give you some instructions. He would give you most of the time a design showing the way to pass from one organization of different movement of the part of the torso to another one. And you would have to look at yourself in the mirror and project the directions that were specified in clear French, words,
Mm-hmm.
very, very good use of geometry in order for you to direct the movements of the part in different organization.
So you were doing you were in doing what you just described,
yeah.
you were essentially inhibiting your habitual way of moving the parts of you.
Of course, but you were also inhibiting the mental habit of doing one thing after the other. Because it was quite clear
okay.
in his view that a movement, integral movement, what he called gesture,
Mm-hmm.
was only true when the different movements of the part were synchronized, were going all together.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
you had to inhibit really trying to do one of the part before another one. You had to really, in fact, work in your mind on how to make an instruction that is sequential, one thing after it. Of course, I have to give you an instruction for that part, and an instruction for that part, and an instruction for the third part or the fourth part.
Right.
There are 4 parts in the torso.
Right.
So they are sequential, of course. And when you recite them, when we repeat them, they are sequential.
Right.
But when you transform this language of communication into an internal language, which means that you memorize the thing, then you have the possibility in your mind to decide how your practical will is going to use this instruction. And your decision is to inhibit, to do one thing after the other, and to allow all together to come through. Well, it needs some training because in front of the mirror, you will see that the inhibition of the one thing after the other is not that simple.
Mm-hmm.
In front of the mirror, you will discover that in fact, yes, there are some instructions that you favor, that you place first, or that you are more confident with, and they start to appear in the mirror before others, and you have to be very clear that it's not what you want. So you have to try again in order for these means to be really organized in a simultaneous way in the mirror. So that's a very, very new way of using inhibition. It's not just, no, I'm not going to start the movement as I do it normally. It's I need to inhibit also on a mental plane. That's why Delsarte considered that his work was a mental training and not a physical training.
So I think any Alexander technique teacher or student listening to this is immediately reminded of Alexander's phrase about at least one of his strings of directions: back, neck free, head to go forward and out, back to lengthen and widen, whatever variation on that.
Yeah.
He would say, people would come to him and say, hey, this is too much. I'm going crazy trying to implement it. And he'd say, well, it's one after the other, but all at the same time. It was sort of his which,
to confuse the pupil even more.
Honestly,
yes.
I don't, yeah. But Delsarte was dealing with exactly that issue, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So he comes up with that, and to what extent was Alexander the beneficiary of that set of discoveries of his?
Well, there is a story that Alexander spent 10 years in front of a mirror in order to solve his voice problem. You know that.
I know the story. Yeah. It's totally incompatible with the timeline, but yeah.
Absolutely incompatible because unfortunately, there are people like me or historians, archaeologists of the Alexander technique that have discovered that, in fact, he solved his voice problem in less than 8 months.
Yeah.
So in order to solve his problem in less than 8 months, he was helped. He had some information, He had help from someone that knew about voice problems. And my guess is that he was helped by somebody that knew Camille Delsarte, for sure.
Yeah.
I understand that.
Right.
And so there are clues in the first 2 books.
Uh-huh.
Because, in the first 2 books, there is one thing I want to mention here, is because engaining is at the start of inhibition. So I should have started with engaining first. And it's quite interesting that there is one, the first mention of engaining in his books, is in Man's Supreme Inheritance. And the way engaining is described is very, very strange, very, very interesting, because engaining in his first book is related to the conscious guidance of the mechanism of the torso. So that is quite strange, So he's talking about engaining as having the end in view.
Right. Yeah.
Engaining, that's why we'd say end. It's the end in view. And after the end, so normally you stop the movement. And of course, Delsarte say, no, you don't stop the first movement. You continue the first movement and you do the second one as well. Okay? So he's saying that, and it's very interesting because I've all my training and listening to conferences and going to workshops, I've been quite aware that we use instructions like, for example, lengthen and widen the back.
Yeah.
Lengthen and widen the torso. Or think up. That's even a better one.
Yeah. Oh, I know.
So
I know.
When he's talking about engaining, he's talking about instructions. He's talking about orders, what he called engaining orders. So the first one that appears in the book is about a guy that is playing golf. Has to swing up and down again in the same orbit, and everybody knows that in order to do that, you have to lengthen the spine. And he said that most orthodox teachings method hold the end in view, and that means that that's without consideration of the means whereby, and he has. That is, means whereby, is defining means whereby, without making certain that the pupil has the power to maintain a proper position of his spine and back.
That's
So,
what those are his exact words there.
yes, that's
Yeah.
his exact word, and the page is 135 in the 1946 edition.
Right.
And so, what you have to understand here is that when you say to somebody, well, sync up, or more clearly, lengthen and widen the back,
Right.
for example.
Right.
This is, exactly the perfect definition for an endgaining order.
Right.
Because you've got
Absolutely.
somebody that cannot lengthen the back, otherwise you wouldn't give that order. Yeah.
And yes, and that from one of our earlier conversations. I mean, that was in your view, that was the general problem with Alexander's directions.
Yes, because they are not geometric. They are not explaining how and what you should use in order to lengthen the back. Well, he knew what was necessary
because he'd been taught by someone who knew about Delsarte, you believe, right?
Yes, because in Delsarte there is something that is called the law of opposition. In the Alexander technique, we call it the what do we call it? We call it the antagonistic action. You know, and so if you imagine the torso that has 4 parts of groups of bones that are articulated together, Mr. Delsarte discovered that you have to direct these parts not to lengthen at all, but to oppose the next one, and also the ones that are opposite in direction, which mean that you have to make sure that you are not solely directing one piece against the 2 others, but you have to group them together, and that is a means whereby of the lengthening of the torso, and it works. It works. It's amazing. It's a breeze. Any new pupil that use that means whereby to lengthen the torso, you don't need to use the word lengthen the torso, but that's what you're going to see in the mirror. So
right.
I'm sure that Alexander knew that, because if he didn't, there was no way he would have cured his voice so quickly.
So he knew that, but when it came to teaching, he used directions, it sounds like, that didn't really enable that.
Exactly. That's so strange.
So I think we should, if it's okay with you, end this conversation here and take up on this in the next conversation. What do you think? Yeah. Okay, is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
So
I'm getting fired up. So
I can tell. But I think we got to chunk this down for our listeners. It's almost too much information to take in. We got to go bit by bit. So let me again just thank my guest today, Jean-Do Massoero, an Alexander technique teacher in Montpellier, France. Jean-Do, thank you so much for this.
Thank you, Robert.